Okay, year 11, so we're now going to be looking at the Golden Age, which took place between 1924 and 1929. We are done with the crisis years, and we are particularly going to be looking at the recovery that occurred under Stresemann. Now, Gustav Stresemann was a centre-right German politician. He is somebody that has been credited with the Golden Age of Weimar Germany. And this is because, first of all, he was Chancellor for a short time in 1923, and during the time that he was Chancellor, he actually helped to end hyperinflation and the Munich Putsch. And then in 1923, in November, he became the Foreign Minister. This is the role that he was best known for, and there were many achievements whilst he was in this position. Let's go on to look at what they were. When we're talking about the golden years, we're going to break it down into different sections. The first one is going to be the extent of political recovery. We're going to be talking about positives and negatives so that you guys can make your own decisions about how far politics are basically recovered in the golden years. So let's start with the positives. First of all, we know that Stresemann was a great political leader. We know that he managed to organise the Grand Coalition of political parties, which basically was 5 major parties that became part of this Grand Coalition of central parties, basically. And this was the best government that the Weimar Germany had ever had. Now, the reason why it was quite strong, of course, was that people were quite happy with this new government, and actually less people were supporting extremist groups like the Nazis and the Communists. And the Nazis at this stage actually only had about 12 seats in the Reichstag in 1928. People were generally quite happy with the government at this stage, and overall, the government were doing things to help the people, like, for example, welfare reforms were made, which of course gave like 3 million new homes to people. People at this stage would have been quite happy about having this new living space. The negatives, on the other hand, is that the political recovery kind of was an image. It wasn't actually stable, it just looked stable. You know, democracy actually collapsed after the Great Depression in 1929, so what that tells us is that there were still some strong underlying trends of issues like nationalism, right-wing politics, and hatred of the Republic. And those things just kind of broke out of the seams once the Great Depression occurred. Now, the last section about negatives is about the fact that the Weimar Republic was led by people that didn't support democracy. So, for example, there's a quote where it says it was a republic without republicans. Politicians like even President Hindenburg, who was supposed to be the leader in this government, was actually abusing Article 48. Now, what that tells us is that he wasn't really supporting democracy. Instead, he was making use of Article 48 to allow himself to rule on his own. Again, that is undermining democracy and shows that he himself wasn't a huge supporter of it. Now, the other thing we need to look at when we're looking at political recovery is obviously the role of the Nazi Party. We've just talked about the fact that the Nazi Party, of course, did not have much support in these years. They had 12 seats in the Reichstag, which is about 2.6% of the overall German vote in 1928. So we're thinking about the fact that the Nazi Party was not particularly popular, therefore they'd had some setbacks and failures. And some of the reasons for this is because of the aftermath of the Munich Putsch. So, for example, one of the consequences of the Munich Putsch was that Hitler was not allowed to speak publicly until 1927. Of course, Hitler was the main kind of image of the Nazi Party. He was the one that attracted a lot of people through his speeches. If he couldn't speak, many people were perhaps less inclined to join the party. The Nazi principles as well of hate and blame were less effective at a time when everyone was reasonably well off. Generally, those things are more popular, and people want to hear that when they feel quite angry about the current situation. If people are feeling quite happy, they don't want to hear about Hitler and the Nazis talking about hate and blame all the time. Now, what we also need to talk about is the fact that during the Stresemann years, or during the Golden Years, this was also a time of consolidation for the Nazis. Because actually, Hitler had used this time as an opportunity to build quietly, waiting for times to go wrong. So, for example, in 1925, the Nazi Party had 27,000 members, but actually it did grow significantly. By 1928, it had 100,000 members. Hitler also secured the help of rich bankers from Germany and America. This, of course, would help him with his propaganda, because he could spend a lot of that money increasing his propaganda and getting the messages out to the people in Germany. He also created the SS in 1925. They were known as the Black Shirts because of their uniform. And remember that the SS were the personal bodyguards that were fanatically loyal to Hitler himself, and these played a huge role later on in time. But he also set up things like the Hitler Youth. Now, of course, the Hitler Youth, again, would become very, very important when the Nazis gained power. But ultimately, the Hitler Youth, of course, meant that more and more children in Nazi Germany were being exposed to some of the ideologies and views of the Nazis from a young age. And this, of course, would become really important later on when the Nazis begin to make groups like the Hitler Youth compulsory. But that's not until they actually get into power. He also put Joseph Goebbels in charge of propaganda. This is incredibly important because Goebbels, as we know, was also a passionate speaker, but also was incredibly skilled at propaganda. And so by becoming the Minister of Propaganda, it meant that that improved. And also they controlled 2 newspapers by this point as well. So what I'm trying to say, guys, is when we're looking at the extent of political recovery, yes, it looks really good on the surfaces, but actually there are some underlying issues. The Nazis were quiet in these years, but they were waiting for something to go wrong, which it did in 1929 with the Great Depression. We're now going to look at the economic recovery in Germany, again looking at the positives and the negatives. Let's start with the positives. First of all, we know that in 1923 hyperinflation was a huge issue, and basically money had become worthless. We know that Stresemann needed to deal with this immediately. Some of the things that he did were quite unpopular. So, for example, sacking public employees or cutting the salaries of others became really unpopular, but it did help to reduce the expenditure of the country. He also reorganised railways and post offices so that they became more profitable. On top of that, and probably one of the really important points, is that he called in the old worthless marks that have been destroyed by hyperinflation. And instead, he introduced a new currency called the Rentenmark. And this was vital in creating economic stability, and of course prices would be able to stabilise again after this. He also called off the general strike in the Ruhr. This basically again made him very unpopular. It kept production going in Germany again, and it got the workers back to work. This, of course, was really important for the economy. And actually, all of these things together led to a gradual recovery in the economy from 1924 to 29. Because remember, the impact of hyperinflation, of course, was kind of being felt in 1923. And so by 1924, once obviously the old worthless marks had been brought in and the Rentenmark was established, the strike was called off, things could then gradually improve throughout time. Another key strength was that he also created lots of kind of pacts or plans with Americans. So, for example, the Dawes Plan. Now, the Dawes Plan was set up in 1924. Now, the Dawes Plan, of course, would help to pay reparations. It was basically about reducing the annual reparation payments so that Germany found it easier to pay off. And also, it arranged for 100 million marks to be loaned from America to Germany. Now, of course, this was important because it meant that Germany could then use this loan to help pay off reparations, but also to build new factories, and they could invest in better infrastructure. This, of course, was going to benefit Germany itself, but also help to stabilise the position they were in with reparations. Now, on top of that, the Young Plan was also signed and created in 1929. This was really important because one of the issues, of course, with the Dawes Plan is that it was based on loans, whereas the Young Plan was about reducing the total amount of reparations. Rather than paying 6.6 billion, the Germans were actually expected to pay 1.8 billion. So it massively reduced the cost of reparations. And on top of that, they extended the final deadline by another 59 years. Remember, they originally had 66 years to pay off, but this gave them an extension. The final positive is that there was proof of economic recovery. For example, the economy was growing at 4% a year, and production and exports were also almost double their 1924 level. That is evidence and factual statistics to state that there was clearly some economic recovery in Germany. However, we've got to look at the negatives as well. One of the negatives is, of course, the fact that Stresemann didn't manage to get back the money that was lost from hyperinflation. There would still be a lot of people in Germany that resented the government for losing their savings. Let's not forget those people that have been saving and everything became worthless after hyperinflation. That money was never recovered. Another negative is that, things like the Dawes Plan were really good in the short term, but actually meant that Germany was entirely dependent on foreign loans. This was dangerous. You've got to think, guys, when the economy collapses after the Great Depression and the Americans call back in the 800 million mark loan, that means that the Germans are going to be stuck in a really difficult position because they are basically going to have to be suffering with the cost of the cut off of trade, but on top of that they're also going to have to pay back the money that they owe to the Americans. Stresemann was aware, of course, that this was an issue, and Stresemann actually stated that they were dancing on the edge of a volcano. Now what that suggests is that things were looking pretty good because they were dancing, but they're on the edge of a volcano, they could slip at any point. And of course we know that Paul Stresemann, of course, does die in 1929, the same year that the Great Depression breaks out. And so, of course, that's when Germany is left in a really dire situation. The next section of our work is going to be looking at the extent of international recovery. So first of all, it's important we recognise the position that Germany was in before 1924. There's a couple of key things, the loss of the war, for example, in 1918, signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, of course, meant that they had quite a difficult relationship with Allied powers. Also, not being invited into the League of Nations when it was set up in 1920 was a big issue as well, because it meant that that was a winners' club and that Germany was excluded from being a world power. Now, in 1924, Stresemann, of course, hoped to improve Germany's international position and to build better relationships with the Allies, particularly as it had been worsened by the invasion of the Ruhr. So in 1924, he first obviously agrees to the Dawes Plan. Now, part of the Dawes Plan, we've already talked about that, giving obviously a loan of 800 million from the USA. But another key point within the Dawes Plan was that it stated that the Ruhr had to be evacuated by the Allied troops. So British troops left in 1926. The French troops did remain there until 1930, but I suppose it does mean that more Allied troops are leaving the Ruhr, and it did begin to stabilise relations with the Allies, especially because reparations were able to be paid again after the loan from the Dawes Plan as well. So the Dawes Plan was really significant in definitely improving international recovery as well as economic recovery as well. In 1925 as well, the Locarno treaties were signed. Now, this was really, really important because Germany was basically agreeing to stick to the territorial terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Now, we know that the Treaty of Versailles in Germany is known as a diktat because it was forced upon the German people. But with the Locarno treaties, it was signed willingly and voluntarily. And this is where basically Stresemann is proving that Germany could be trusted again and that they were ready to move on from the war. And this, of course, was influential in letting them into the League of Nations. Once the League of Nations obviously invited Germany to join, this was then seen as a great, great success. Stresemann actually regarded it as his greatest achievement. Now, once Germany, of course, was accepted into the League of Nations, they became a world power again. In fact, Germany actually became one of the leading members of the League of Nations. In 1928, we also can think about the fact that the Calais-Briand Pact was signed. This was basically where Stresemann signed with 65 other nations to say that no countries, including Germany, would use force to resolve their disputes. This was really, really important because, again, it helped nations to trust Germany, especially as they were one of the first to sign this pact and say that they were not willing to use violence. Instead, they would go to the League of Nations if they had any issues at all. The final section we need to look at is 1929, where Stresemann basically negotiated the Young Plan. The Young Plan, of course, we know helped the economy, but actually it also led to the French finally leaving the Ruhr. And of course, by cutting reparations drastically, it helped Germany to pay off their reparations more easily, and this would also help to ease relations with the Allies. If reparations were being paid, it also showed that Germany was willing to keep moving forward with that as well. So actually, Stresemann was really successful in his international recovery. There are lots of great improvements here. This was probably, for me, his greatest area of success because, of course, getting into the League of Nations meant that Germany would be seen as a leading power again. Of course, it's after 1929 and obviously the movement towards the rise of Hitler, and that's when obviously Germany kind of falls out of position with the Allies and comes out of the League of Nations in 1933. So that's where things begin to go badly. But I would say that in the years 1924 to 29, the international recovery is really strong. Okay, so we're going to move on to the last section for the golden years now, looking at culture and whether that developed in Weimar Germany. So we're going to start by looking at the positives and the negatives. So let's look at the positives first of all and think about why there were clear developments in the cultural golden age. So first of all, it is known that the Weimar Republic was seen as a time of cultural innovation for a number of different reasons. And the bullet points here just demonstrate the reasons why Weimar is seen as a time of cultural innovation. So the first bit is about developing architecture. So we've got the Bauhaus architecture that's particularly quite prominent in the Weimar period, and this is where architecture just completely changes and we begin to see more functional, I suppose, practical forms of architecture as opposed to more decorative. We also begin to see differences in art. So, for example, Grothendieck's are more modern artists, and they depict particular pictures that were quite controversial about World War I and showing images about soldiers not being heroic but being perhaps damaged from the war in some way, one way or another. And this was, of course, criticised by more right-wing groups who did not feel that this was respectful towards those that had fought in the war. The third one is looking at the German film industry, which is actually the largest in Europe. And then we've also got the fourth point about how Germany was famous for its quite liberal and modern attitudes. So, for example, in Germany, you could go to nightclubs, you could watch cabarets, and within these cabarets, they quite often had a lot of open sexuality. So this often meant open homosexuality as well. So, for example, you might have the presence of gay people within these cabarets, and quite often as well, the plays were more left-wing in their views and sometimes criticised right-wing government, right-wing groups, or mocked the past under the Kaiser and things like that. So again, more traditional people would see this as quite inappropriate, decadent, and they perhaps wouldn't have enjoyed this movement towards more modern liberal attitudes. The final section is about how there was also a bit of an anti-war sentiment. I've already talked about that kind of being present in modern art, but also within the book by Remarques, who basically had written the book called All Quiet on the Western Front. Now, this book was published in 1929, and it basically was about criticising World War I. So again, that wouldn't really appeal to those people that wanted to glorify war in some way. So they're the positives about how, I mean, to be honest, overall, it's about seeing culture as being more open-minded, it's much more modern, and that is generally how things began to change. I think there's also a real difference for women, particularly when it comes to, like, you know, we talked about the open sexuality, for example, in cabarets. That was particularly for women as well, who became more sexualised, wearing different outfits and wearing their hair shorter and things like that. And I suppose that kind of comes in line with some other changes at the time, such as, you know, women getting the right to vote and having more rights to an education and a career and things like that. So that kind of falls hand in hand. The negatives of the cultural golden age then is mostly just about the fact that many Germans, of course, were still right-wing, and so especially the right-wing organisations like the Nazis, they regarded Weimar culture as incredibly decadent and immoral, and therefore, I suppose, although these cultural changes are seen as innovative and a step towards modern society, it certainly divided German people at the time, because some people liked these changes and some people certainly didn't approve of them, and that's one of the reasons when we get into Nazi Germany, we begin to see a reversal of these cultural changes. Okay, so for our last section, we're going to be talking about how and why Hitler became Chancellor. And for those of you that might be wondering why this is not with Hitler's Germany, that is because when we get onto Hitler's Germany, we're talking about what things were like once Hitler actually became Chancellor. This section is just looking at how and why Hitler became Chancellor, looking particularly at why people voted for him. So in terms of the different reasons for why people voted for the Nazis, the first, and for me, one of the most important ones, is of course the Great Depression and its impact in the 1930s. So remember, the Great Depression, of course, begins with the Wall Street crash from October 1929, and what that led to is that the Americans were in such a state of dismay with their economy that they asked the Germans essentially to give back what they had loaned them in the Dawes Plan in 1924. So, of course, this meant that the Germans had to return the 800 million that they'd essentially taken from the United States, and although that may have helped the United States, it certainly left the Germans in a very difficult position. And on top of that, with the Americans reducing their trade because of the Great Depression, what that meant is that the German businesses essentially were damaged. They were collapsing all around Germany. There were 50,000 businesses collapsing around Germany. And this was largely because trade was basically reducing. And so there was less need for some of the materials or produce or items that were being developed in these factories or businesses. And therefore, a lot of people either were made unemployed, or sometimes the businesses just completely collapsed. So in terms of obviously the businesses collapsing, that then resulted in 6 million Germans being unemployed by 1932. And that is, of course, incredibly important because those people are then desperate. They're looking for work. And on top of that, what made things even worse was the fact that Bruning's government, which existed from 1930 to 32, basically cut social benefits and public workers' pay. What you can imagine is that people are already in a state of dismay because they're unemployed, they're desperate, they need the money. And on top of that, the government cuts their social benefits. So there's actually a lot of social hardship. And basically, the government becomes incredibly unpopular. Now, this obviously opens doors for Hitler and the Nazis because what they can do is they can promise that they're going to be different. The Nazis promised that they were going to provide work and bread at a time when people required exactly that. So it's important that you definitely make sure you record that key message that the Nazis were trying to get across in their speeches. On top of that, the depression and the problems that came with it also led to Hindenburg being forced to use the emergency powers of Article 48. And of course, this meant that, again, there was a sign of political chaos. And actually, in 1932, there were 3 different chancellors in 1 year alone. I mean, that just shows political chaos. And basically, they couldn't get a majority in the Reichstag, and they couldn't even form a proper coalition that was basically going to stand. So that basically meant there was political chaos. And of course, again, that helps the Nazis, doesn't it, to suggest that again they're going to be different and that they're going to bring stability and order to Germany at a time when it looks quite chaotic. Now, obviously, it's important we recognise as well, when it came to voting at this time, moderate parties like the SDP actually lost support. Their votes were decreasing as the Great Depression made them look incompetent, whereas basically the extremist groups were actually gaining more votes. And that's not just the Nazis, that's also the communists as well. So just generally extremist groups were seeing more support as people were looking for desperate solutions. So on top of that, when we think about the results that kind of speak for themselves, I think, the number of Nazi seats in the Reichstag rose from 12 in 1928 to 230 in July 1932. That rapid increase from 1928 to 32 clearly shows that something happened in the middle. Now, for me, I think it's obvious that the Great Depression in 1929 was the real trigger for that change in votes. Of course, yes, the Nazis also had very charismatic speeches, and of course they used their propaganda to their advantage, but their propaganda and their speeches were being listened to more because of the Great Depression, and I think that really does come through with the results there. Hitler was still the same speaker in 1928. Propaganda, of course, was still relatively good in 1928 as well. You've got to think about Goebbels being employed by that point. So I would argue that the really, really great factor that makes that difference is the Great Depression, the desperate measures that the people of Germany felt they needed to take in order to get back their jobs and their food. Right, let's move on to number 2 then. So we're looking now at the weaknesses of the Weimar government. Now, we've largely just talked a little bit about one of the weaknesses of the Weimar government, and that's particularly their response to the Great Depression, which of course definitely kind of again led to more popularity for the Nazis and other extremist groups. But also there was kind of a long-term reason for why Hitler became Chancellor, and that's the long-term weaknesses of the Weimar government. We talked about this in last lesson when we talked about the constitutional weaknesses from the very beginning, and the fact that actually the government was kind of built on shaky foundations. It was hated from the very beginning because it had signed the Treaty of Versailles on the 28th of June 1919. And what that then meant is that they were responsible for Germany having to pay reparations. The Dawes Plan, of course, was also to many seen as a negative because, of course, it was loaning money from the US, and that is kind of one of the reasons why Germany had fallen onto hardship in the Great Depression. But also, the government was seen as responsible for hyperinflation in 1923 as well. So many people had lost faith in the government overall, felt that they just couldn't deal with problems effectively. So in terms of obviously historians' views, many historians actually believe that if hyperinflation hadn't happened from the very beginning, so like 1923, many Germans actually may have had more faith in their government and wouldn't have voted for the Nazis. So what that tells us is it's not just the government's reaction to the Great Depression, but it's the fact that this is kind of the cherry on the top, and the Germans have kind of seen this as the last resort, and they're thinking, you know what, the government for many years has struggled or failed to deal with problems effectively, and so that's why many people started turning to more radical groups. Some of the other long-term weaknesses within the government was, of course, proportional representation. So we know, for example, that percentage of votes equaling percentage of seats meant that there were lots and lots of small parties, weak coalitions in government, and they were easily overturned in government as well. And this happened especially during the Great Depression. The other one as well is Article 48. Again, from the very beginning, this undermined democratic government, and it gave the head of state, the president, the right to essentially rule alone. And from the very beginning, that kind of shows actually the German government didn't really believe in using democratic measures if they could get around it. We know that particularly people like Aber and Hindenburg had actually overused Article 48 or exploited it in some way as well. The other one that we really need to mention is the right-wing judges and the government officials, because of course we know that these people have been responsible for giving right-wing rebels very lenient sentences after they had tried to overthrow the government. These people also wanted a return of dictatorship. So we've got to think about the fact that if these people exist in government, then ultimately that's going to only help extremist groups like the Nazis who are trying to get into power. We know that obviously the right-wing judges previously had not dealt with extremists effectively enough. We know that Kapp, for example, was the only person arrested in the Kapp putsch, and Hitler only served 9 months of a 5-year sentence for treason, essentially. So that tells us that right-wing judges had allowed extremists to get away with obviously performing illegal acts, and that's not even to mention the assassinations that had occurred from right-wing groups as well. So on lots of occasions, basically right-wingers were getting away with murder and rebellion, and that had basically in some ways prevented Hitler and the Nazis from eventually growing to a position where they could take on the government democratically, which is what they're about to do now. Okay, so our third reason for why people voted for Hitler was fear of communism. And quite often this fear of communism actually led to financial backing. So let's look at a couple of different examples. The first one comes from Germany itself. For some German financiers and industrialists, so for example, people like Schacht and Krupp, basically they wanted weak trade unions. Now these men were businessmen. They didn't like trade unions because trade unions were constantly campaigning and trying to fight for better rights for their workers. So, for example, getting them better pay or reducing their working hours. This wasn't profitable, really, or beneficial to the businessmen themselves. And so they didn't like trade unions. And they knew that Hitler was not a fan of them either. In fact, one of the things that Hitler does once he passes the Enabling Act, and that's something you'll look at in Nazi Germany, he actually gets rid of trade unions pretty much straight away with that power. So what we're looking at is people that are supporting the Nazis because they think it benefits them. We've also got the American businessmen. So people like Henry Ford, for example, actually funded the Nazis. And this was because he was afraid of communism and the spread of it. Henry Ford, as an American businessman, would not like communism because what communism threatened for businessmen was basically taking control of all businesses, having state ownership of businesses. What this would mean is that the American businessmen themselves would not be able to continue that independent, profit from the business. And, what we wouldn't have is people making multi-millions from their business. Instead, the money would be going into the government, and of course, people would get what they needed from that. So, of course, American businessmen absolutely despised communism because it would basically prevent them from getting the wealth that they are currently getting. And so the Nazis promising to destroy communism would ultimately please them. And so because of that, the Nazis were able to create an extensive Nazi propaganda program because they were being funded by men like Henry Ford. Now, don't forget, Joseph Goebbels was behind this propaganda machine, and of course he was quite skilled in propaganda, so having more money to be able to exploit that further would only benefit the Nazis in their campaign. What we've also got to think about is the middle classes and the upper classes as well, actually. These guys had some, they had some difficulties of their own that they felt needed to be addressed. So, for example, middle class businessmen felt that there was competition from Jewish people that had businesses in Germany. And these middle class businessmen wanted to get rid of their Jewish competitors to basically bring greater profit to themselves. And in some cases as well, they were concerned about law and order. So these are some of the concerns they had that led them to vote for the Nazis, because the Nazis were quite clearly anti-Semitic, and also they were all about order and discipline. And so by having concerns about law and order, they might hope that the Nazis were going to eradicate that issue. Another worry that the middle and upper classes had was communism again. So the communists had actually managed to gain 16.9% of the vote in 1932. That was their highest ever. This was a concern for the middle and upper classes who feared communism. And so again, they wanted to vote for the Nazis, hoping to get rid of the communist threat. The fourth reason why people voted for the Nazis was the strong party organisation. And this also included strong electioneering as well. Let's go through a few examples of this. So first of all, we know that Hitler had actually spent the years 1924 to 1929 building up a strong National Party organisation. Now, even though these were the Stresemann years, the golden years, the Nazis were working quietly to essentially wait for bad things to happen, to merge back onto the surface again. So first of all, we know that during this time, they actually had managed to increase their membership. They had 100,000 committed members. And also, let's not forget that by this point, they also had increased the numbers of the SA, and also the SS had been created in 1925. They were personal bodyguards to Hitler, and remember that they also were fanatically loyal to Hitler, and so they were willing to carry out his instructions very, very carefully. And also the brilliant propaganda campaign under Goebbels, which we've already talked about as well as part of the last section, also definitely helped the Nazis to get into power. Some of the other different things, so for example, attacks on other parties were quite important for strong party organisation. What we know is that the SA basically were quite often used to frighten Nazi opponents. So for example, if there was a communist gathering at one point, the SA could be used to destroy that gathering. They could be sent to basically beat up some of the leaders, make it look like the communists could not maintain order, and then the SA would be used to defend Nazi meetings, to make it appear like the Nazis were strong and organised, and of course that would appeal to voters who wanted a strong government and law and order. The Nazis also had strong election campaigns, which also included well-designed leaflets and posters. These posters often represented images and messages about Hitler being the last hope in Germany. This was particularly important after the Great Depression. So it's really important we understand that's again part of the propaganda campaign. The other thing that we could talk about is the fact that Hitler travelled by plane. Now, this, of course, seemed extremely modern for the time, and what it also meant is that Hitler was able to campaign all over Germany, and he was able to do this very quickly as well. And because of this, people felt that Hitler was reaching out to the people personally. What he wasn't doing is connecting with people over the radio, which would seem less personal, and that's something that other politicians were doing. The Nazis also held huge rallies at places like Nuremberg, and these rallies were emotionally thrilling, and they basically showed the strength of the Nazis. The Nazis would march in unison with the SA and the SS in uniform, and of course, again, this made the kind of appearance that the Nazis were organised and strong, and people that wanted this were certainly going to find this appealing. Our final section about why Hitler became Chancellor is number 5, his personal qualities. So essentially, guys, this is again quite an important one, as Hitler was, as we know, the figurehead really of the party. And it's important to understand why people liked him and why people voted for him as a person. The first one is about the fact that he was considered to be a war hero, somebody that had won medals for bravery and that was therefore considered to be loyally German. He'd fought for the German people, of course, in World War I, and that would be especially, a really important point for any right-wing people in the country. We also know that Mein Kampf, that was written whilst he was in prison, and also the Munich Putsch and the kind of the media sensation that came from that certainly made him very well known. We also know that he was a really charismatic speaker, and because of that, that's why a lot of people were kind of engaged to him. You've also got to think about the fact that he was driven by self-belief. Now, what that means is that he seemed to believe in himself when he was saying what he was saying. So when he was promising people work and bread, he appeared to believe it, and that therefore that confidence gave people a lot of faith in him that he could deliver. He was offered the post of Vice Chancellor twice, but he'd refused, and was eventually, reluctantly, made Chancellor by Hindenburg on the 30th of January 1933. It's also important to recognise that he wasn't just running to be Chancellor. Hitler had also run to be president in the presidential elections of 1932, and actually he was actually really popular in that, and he received a third of the votes in that particular election as well. So what that tells us is that people actually did like him as an individual, and that obviously would have helped with some of the votes in Germany. Right, Year 11, that basically concludes our knowledge for Weimar Germany. So now what I'm going to suggest is that you make sure that you're preparing for your short answer test. That will be tested next week. You need to make sure that you are going over the questions and answers that have been uploaded onto Show My Homework. It's also important, guys, that you continue to make revision materials for Weimar Germany. So remember that you can make revision clocks, you can make flashcards, you can make mind maps, and you could do this for the whole of Weimar Germany, or you could break it down into sections. So for example, you could do a mind map on the crisis years, you could do a mind map on the golden years, and then you could do a mind map on why people voted for Hitler. It's up to you, but I would really recommend that you go over this stuff because there's a lot to cover really in Weimar Germany. As you have seen, it has taken us 2 hours to cover it. So you've got your short answer test to prepare for. It will be online again, and you've also got some revision materials to make off your own back as well. And obviously, you can make those according to how you work best. Thank you so much for listening, Year 11, and I will speak to you again when we're on exam technique.